Hello and welcome to a quick revision session reminding you for Edexcel GCSE History June 2017 what exam style questions look like and how it is that you need to structure your answer to them. So we'll start with the first type of question you'll see on your paper, which is a 6-mark inference question. So it'll say something like, what can you learn from source A, or something along those lines. What you need to do in answer to that type of 6-mark inference question, what can you learn from the source or what does it tell us about X, is 2 paragraphs and you need to use source details, so you need to quote something from the source and explain what that tells us or what that shows us about whatever the topic is in the question. So to give you an example, we'd have something like, one thing the source can tell us about the effect of the Blitz is, so you'd state something it tells us like there was a lot of destruction and death caused by the Blitz. You give some evidence. So this is shown when, what can you see in the source, or what specifically does the source say? So you have to make sure you use source detail. So this is shown when the source says or when the source shows. And then you need to explain the inference. So this shows, or this means that there was a lot of devastation and death caused because we know that lots of people in hospital and there would have been a great level of death because they would have been unable to escape due to previous issues or injuries or who are crowded or whatever it might be. So the key is state something that you can learn from the source or that it shows you. Give the evidence, where is that in the source, and explain how the source shows you that. Try to avoid just stating things you can see, like we can learn that people were injured. For example, it shows people were injured, this means people were injured. Try to go into a little bit more depth than that. So one thing the source tells us is that there were lots of injuries. This is shown when we can see large numbers of casualties on the ground as a result of the Blitz. This means that people were suffering new types of injuries and civilians were facing battlefield wounds for the first time, unlike in previous wars, whatever it might be. So try to state what the source tells you or shows you. State your evidence, so what in the source shows you that. That's very important. And then explain a little further what inference you can make. And then you do the same again, so a second paragraph, a second inference you can make. So you can definitely get away with 2 paragraphs in a 6-mark question, so long as you use lots of details and explain fully the points that you are making. The second type of question you're going to come across on your Impact of War paper is going to be an 8-mark question, and it'll ask you about the purpose of a source. So, for example, what is the purpose of source B, or whatever it might be. This requires you for 8 marks to have a brief introduction, like a sentence or 2 at most, 2 paragraphs explained and linked saying what the purpose of the source is, and you need to use the source and your own knowledge. So, for example, we've got here, you could have paragraph 1. One purpose of the source is to, what was the purpose? So maybe it's raising morale during the Blitz. Maybe it's trying to persuade people to do something. Perhaps it's someone trying to record their own personal memories so they can look back on it in years to come. So what's the purpose of the source? The evidence for that. So this is shown by the fact that quote something you can see in the source, or quote something that the source says that's evidence that that was its purpose. Then we explain. So why was this important? This was important because, and then link back to the question. This is not the only purpose of the source. It was also created to, paragraph 2. Another purpose of the source is to, what was another purpose of the source? Did it have a sort of governmental purpose? Were they trying to overcome sort of threat or issue to the country at the time? Is there a reason why they've been needing to raise morale at this point? Are they trying to make sure that people overcome the problem of the lack of men and get them into the workforce? Or perhaps they're trying to prevent there being a larger number of conscientious objectors in World War I. Think about a second purpose for the source. Then evidence. So, for example, the source says or the source shows. This is important because, and then link back to the question. So, a key reason for the source being created is. So, think about what the main reason for your source being created is. You need 2 key reasons why the source was created. In particular, things that might help you would be things like looking at the date of the source. So, was there a particular event at the time that you might need to mention? You could look at the author of the source, who's created it, why might they have created this, what reason might they have for trying to persuade people to think or do something in particular. Is it clear in the source what that thing is? And then also you could think about the content as well as a clue. You must use your own knowledge as well as the source. So, for example, you could say, if you're talking about the date of the source, you could use your own knowledge of something that was going on at this time. Or if you're using your own knowledge of the author of the source, you could mention something about that. So we've got an example here. One purpose of the source was to raise morale during the Blitz. This is shown by the fact that the royals are standing in front of Buckingham Palace, which has clearly been bombed by the Luftwaffe, but they're still smiling and don't seem to be affected. This is to show that the royal family still had high morale despite the Blitz, and that everyone could carry on, keep calm and carry on. This is important because at this time the Germans were bombing London constantly during the Blitz. So this bit here we're adding in our own knowledge. So I know that at this time, or this was important because we've got the Germans were bombing London during the Blitz, and every night hundreds of bombs were dropped on London. It was every single night for a couple of months. If the royal family showed that they were suffering along with the rest of London, it could help increase morale. It was also important to increase morale because what else do you know is going on at this time that makes it so important? We know that it's really important that they have lots and lots of volunteers continue, the VADs, for example, the ambulance drivers, the money that's being given willingly to ambulance funds that managed to put together about 512 ambulances in a matter of weeks. This is not the only purpose of the source because it's also created too. So you get the idea. It's really important to state clearly the purpose of the source, give evidence from the source, so quote something that shows that, and explain how it shows that that was the purpose of the source, and use your own knowledge to say why that purpose was important at that time. So it's important to do this at the time because, etc. So 2 paragraphs will get you 8 out of 8, so long as you use your own knowledge, quote the sources, and fully explain what their purposes were. The third type of question you're going to come across on your paper is a 10-mark question, and it will say explain X using the source and your own knowledge. So for example, what part did women play in the war effort in the Second World War? Explain the answer using source E and your own knowledge. Or it could be something completely different, but explain something in World War I or World War II or as legacy of something. Explain your answer using the source and your own knowledge. What it's looking for is 2 paragraphs, 2 fully explained paragraphs using source detail and your own knowledge. Think about, what does the source tell you? Can you support or challenge this with your own knowledge? So paragraph 1, we have things like the source says or the source shows. What does it say or show about the topic you've been asked about? This suggests. What does it suggest about the topic you've been asked about? So if it's about women, the source says that huge numbers of women were involved in volunteering in World War II. For example, it says blah, blah, blah. This suggests that huge numbers of women were volunteering into groups like the Land Army, blah, 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 blah. I know that at this time, how much does it tell you? So I know that at this time, actually, more women were involved in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force than the Land Army because, etc., etc., etc. This was widespread, or this was common, because think about how you could challenge the source. So is this source really useful for showing you about what everyone would have experienced, or a particular group, say in the town, in the countryside, women, men, younger, older people? How widespread or common would this occurrence have been? Paragraph 2, you just repeat the same thing. So the source also says or also shows, pick something else you can see, quote it, or pick something else that it says and quote it. Explain what that suggests about the topic in question. This suggests that the work that they were doing was unpopular, for example, with men. I know that at this time, explain, would this be a wide held view? Is this something that everyone would have experienced? Is it something really common? Is it just in the town? Is it just in the city? Is it just in that particular year? Would it have been throughout the war? So have a think about what you know about this at that time. It's really important you add lots of own knowledge about whatever it is you can spot in the source, because the question asks you to use both the source and your own knowledge to explain the role of a particular group or whatever else it might be. So make sure you fully explain further using your own knowledge what you know about that particular topic in order to get yourself the 10 marks. Then if we go on to look at the fourth question, this will ask you, again, it's a 10-mark question, and it'll ask you about the reliability of sources. So how reliable are sources X and Y for 10 marks? So an example, how reliable are sources B and C as evidence of the success of evacuation? Explain your answer using B and C and your own knowledge. What they're looking for are 2 paragraphs using detail from the sources and your own knowledge. You need to consider the nature of the source, so who created it, when and why, and also the content, how accurate is it, and you need a mini conclusion. So 1 paragraph looking at the nature and reliability of the source, 1 looking perhaps more at the content and how accurate it is, and then you can then go on to a mini conclusion, or you could have 1 paragraph focusing on both the nature and the content, so how reliable is source 1, looking at the content, how accurate is that content, and then you could have paragraph 2, the nature of source 2, the content of source 2, and a mini conclusion. Overall, how reliable are those 2 sources? So those are the things to think about. I would advise it's probably easiest to structure your answer like this. So you'll have paragraph 1 all about source 1. Why is the nature of source 1 reliable or unreliable? Who wrote it? When was it written? How would that affect what they're saying? Why is the content accurate or less accurate? What do you know about this time? Then go on paragraph 2 about source 2. Why is the nature of source 2 reliable or unreliable? Why is the content of source 2 reliable or unreliable? How accurate is it based on what you know? Make sure you use your own knowledge and don't just quote things in the source. Mini conclusion, overall sources B and C or whatever it might be are to a large or to a small extent or not reliable at all because, or source A is more reliable than source B because, or whatever else it might be. So a mini conclusion stating what you have found. Things to consider. What makes the content of source reliable or unreliable? Do they support information we've already learnt about the topic? Is the content accurate? Does it miss out information that we might need? What makes the nature of the source reliable or unreliable? When were they made? What's going on at the time? Why were they made? Is it trying to persuade you of something? Is there any evidence of subjectivity or objectivity in the sources? So it's looking for you to write 2 paragraphs and a conclusion. 1 paragraph looking at the nature, where does the information come from, etc., and content accuracy of source 1, 1 on source 2, and a conclusion. Overall, how reliable are both those sources? If it asks about 2 sources, make sure you answer about both sources. Finally, we'll look at the 16 marker, or actually what is a 19 mark question on this paper. So you also get 3 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar on this very last question, question 5. So it's worth having a check through. What you'll be faced with is a question where there'll be a statement in quote marks, and it will say, how far do you agree using sources X, Y, Z and your own knowledge for 16 marks. So for example, you might get asked something like, source B suggests that after the Second World War, attitudes to women and the role of women in society reverted to the way they had been before the war. How far do you agree with this interpretation? Explain your answer using sources B, C and D and your own knowledge. So the important thing here is I would suggest you start by highlighting key things in your answer so that it's really easy for you to pick out what it is exactly that the question wants you to do. So for example, this one says, source B suggests that after the Second World War, attitudes to women and the role of women in society changed to how they had been before the war. So it's saying, this statement is saying that things didn't change for women very much. So during the war it might have changed, but after the war it went back to traditional views and attitudes towards women. Then it says, how far do you agree with this interpretation? So how far do you agree with this interpretation? You need to explain your answer using both the sources and your own knowledge. So you need to have both of those things in there. So the attitudes to women and the role of women went back to how it had been before the war. So my suggestion to you would be, start by having a look through all of the sources. B, C and D, and potentially also other sources in the paper if you wish to use those, and decide for each of those sources which one suggests which thing. So it actually tells us source B suggests that, so we've got that one already, that source B agrees, so I'd have agree, disagree, make a little column, be saying, okay, well source B says this, okay, perhaps source C disagrees with that statement, and it shows that things did change for when maybe source D agrees with source B. So how do we answer this type of question? Statement, how far do you agree using the sources in your own knowledge? So once you've gone through the sources and you've decided which ones agree with the statement, which ones disagree, you also need to have a quick think about what own knowledge you have. So what evidence do you have that would agree? What evidence do you have that would disagree? Then you're going to structure your answer in 2 paragraphs and a conclusion. So you could make a quick statement in your introduction. I would say a maximum of a sentence or 2. Don't spend too long on your introduction, stating what you'll argue. So literally just, to a great extent, I agree with the statement that X, or to a limited extent, or I completely disagree with the statement. So just a quick sentence will do as your introduction. Then paragraph 1, this needs to be a nice lengthy paragraph. So on the one hand, what does the source say? How does it agree? So you've got in the question already a particular source and what that states. So we could say on the one hand, source B agrees that. What is it that it agrees about? Whatever it says in the question. It shows that attitudes did revert back because, etc., etc. In the source, quote something the source says or shows, explain how that agrees with the statement. I know this is accurate because at this time, add in your own knowledge. The source is reliable or unreliable because, why can we trust that source to be true or not trust it to be true? If it's supported by other sources, you could also add something like, the source is also supported by source D or E or Z or whatever it is, because this source says, which suggests, I know this is accurate because at this time, etc. So one paragraph looking at how you can agree with the statement in the question. The second paragraph needs to look at how you can disagree with the statement in the question. So for example, however, source C, for example, disagrees with source B that rephrase the statement in the question. It shows that attitudes didn't revert back, or it shows that whatever else it might be. For example, what does it show? What does this suggest to us? I know this is accurate because at this time, add your own knowledge in. Another, this source is reliable or unreliable, or more reliable than the previous paragraph's one, or less reliable than the previous paragraph, because why? Why was it created? Why might they have had reason to lie, exaggerate? Why might they miss out information? Why might it only reflect a certain particular experience? Perhaps it was in the countryside or in the city, or a particular age group or gender. The source is supported by other sources, such as use another source, back it up. So you've got those 2 paragraphs where you've got lots of evidence from the sources. You think about what they state, what the sources mean, how they back it up, how reliable other sources, how accurate using your own knowledge, what other sources support them. If you do that for 2 paragraphs, you've got yourself a really, really solid answer. Then the key to getting yourself the 16 out of 16, the top marks, is a really good conclusion. So overall, source, the source that's quoted in the question argues whatever it argues. We can or can't trust this source because, or this group view is largely or mostly or to some extent or vaguely supported by the other 2 sources because. It can be argued that the attitude change, or it can't be argued. So try and come to some kind of conclusion. Overall, how far do you agree with the statement? How far is it backed up by the other sources? Why are you persuaded by it? Perhaps you think the sources are particularly reliable, or from your own knowledge the information in the sources is particularly accurate. Try and give a reason for your overall conclusion and make sure that you are actually answering the question, how far do you agree with that statement that you saw at the beginning. That's the end of this revision session, looking at the different styles of exam question that you'll come across on this paper. My advice to you would be to have a go. Look through your revision booklets, pick a source, or look through your books and pick a source and have a go at an exam style question. You could create your own, or you could use the ones at the back of your booklet to help you. Good luck with your revision.